The sky over Xiangwan village was gray that morning, not with clouds, but with silence. Not a single rooster crowed, not a single leaf moved. And when the old bell at the ancestral hall rang once, then twice, then 3 times, everyone knew. Yuan Wei was dead. The only son of the Yuan family, barely 23, the kind of young man who helped old widows carry firewood and still called his parents father and mother with reverence. Gone, just like that. They found him by the riverbank, arms folded across his chest like someone had tucked him in, but the ground around him was undisturbed. His shoes were clean, his body cold. No bruises, no blood, just silence. The villagers whispered of a soul taken too cleanly, as if something came for him, not to kill, but to claim. His mother, Madame Yuan, didn't weep, not at first. She sat outside their house, still as stone, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if her son would return from the fields. But night fell, he didn't come back, and that's when she screamed. A sound like torn silk and thunder all at once. Old Master Yuan, her husband, stood beside the funeral altar. He didn't speak, not even when the incense burned low and the candle sputtered, not even when the undertaker asked about the burial plot. The family had money, not much, but enough. Enough to hold a proper ritual, enough to bury their son with honor, but not enough to let him go. Because Yuan Wei had died unmarried. No wife, no child, no continuation of the Yuan name. That, in this village, was more than grief. It was an unfinished duty. A dead son without a bride meant a wandering soul, one that could not rest, one that might come back, not out of vengeance, but out of yearning. And yearning spirits don't knock before they enter. 3 nights after the funeral, Madame Yuan visited the home of an old paper artisan who lived at the edge of the forest. She brought with her 3 things: a silver hairpin once belonging to Yuan Wei's grandmother, a faded photograph of her son smiling beside a paper lantern, and a sealed red envelope containing an ancestral blessing rarely used since the Qing dynasty fell. She said, "I want a bride, one he can take with him." The artisan, a woman nearly blind with age, did not speak for a long time. Then she touched the photograph with trembling fingers and whispered, "There are rules." Madame Yuan's eyes didn't blink. Break them. The next day, the smoke over the Yuan household no longer came from incense, but from the long coils of yellow paper being folded into limbs, silk strips being shaped into lips, and crimson thread stitched into a smile. By dusk, the bride stood, tall, elegant, pale as ash, wrapped in a red qipao embroidered with phoenix feathers and wedding peonies. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her head tilted in modesty, her painted eyes lowered in silence, and deep inside her chest, where no one looked, was the seal of a name written in black ink, then crossed out, then written again. The name was not hers, but the name had been given. And that is where everything went wrong. The villagers were not told. Only the oldest in the Yuan family were summoned that night. 4 uncles, 2 widowed aunts, and the head of the ancestral hall. They arrived in silence, each dressed in mourning blue. No one asked why there was no coffin. No one dared question why there was a wedding altar instead of a shrine. Because in Xiangwan village, there were things you didn't name, and marriages you didn't bless aloud. The courtyard had been swept 3 times with salt water and sage. A large paper canopy, woven with red silk and bamboo threads, hung above the altar. On it was a single character, hand-painted in blood-mixed ink, double happiness. But the air was wrong. Too still, too dry. The kind of dryness that crackled in the bones and made matches flare too fast. The moon, swollen and red like a blister, hung low in the sky, barely above the treetops. At exactly the 3rd hour of the dog, 9 p.m., the bride was carried out. 4 men bore her paper frame on a lacquered red palanquin. She was light as dried lotus petals, yet every step groaned like something heavier clung to her. Her hands were folded across her lap. Her paper eyelids remained closed, but the villagers who peeked from behind wooden shutters swore they saw something twitch beneath her veil. The ritual began. Madame Wan lit the ceremonial candles, one for the living, one for the dead. The match sparked too long, then burned out. She tried again. This time, the candle lit, but the flame leaned sideways against the wind. A cold wind from the direction of the graveyard. Still, the ceremony continued. The priest, a trembling man borrowed from a neighboring town who had never performed such rites, read from the Book of Spirits. His voice cracked on the 3rd line. His hands shook so hard he spilled black rice over the offering plate. When it was time to bind the bride and the groom, the paper hand was placed beside Yuanwei's old robe. The red wedding thread was tied around both. May they find each other in the shadowed realm. May her soul anchor his. May no yearning remain unfulfilled. Then came the fire. They laid the bride's body atop a copper brazier. The coals had been prepared hours in advance, soaked in pine resin and foxglove, as the old books dictated. The match was struck, the flame caught, and for a moment, everything was still. The qipao blazed first, the phoenix stitching curling into smoke, her legs folded inward, paper crinkling like old parchment. Her chest darkened, peeled, melted. Her chest split open as the bamboo ribs inside collapsed. Then, the wind changed. It didn't come gradually. It snapped, like the whole world inhaled through clenched teeth. The flames twisted, not upward, but sideways. Ash scattered, yes, but not into the sky. They fell backward, toward the altar, toward the family, toward the photograph of Yuanwei. And when the final strip of paper burned, the wind died. Dead still. Too still. The ashes did not rise. The smoke did not thin. And no one spoke the words of closing, because deep inside the brazier, something glowed. Not flame, not coal. A faint ember, round and red, like the dot between a bride's brows. And the priest, pale and shaking, whispered, "She didn't leave." 3 days after the paper wedding, the village of Xiangwan fell into an uneasy stillness. The skies hung silver gray without sun, without rain. Even the trees held their breath. Birds refused to sing. The fish in the ponds stopped rippling the water. Everything was waiting. That morning, just after the 4th rooster crowed, though no roosters had crowed that day, a girl appeared on the dirt path that led into the village. She came alone. No cart, no shoes, no sound except the dry crunch of her bare feet on the gravel. She was tall for a village girl, slender and poised, as if every step was choreographed. Her skin was pale, nearly the same hue as the ash scattered at the Yuan household courtyard. She wore a red qipao, embroidered with faded peony flowers and phoenix feathers, its hem scorched and curled as if licked by fire. And around her neck, barely visible beneath her collar, was a thin red thread. The children playing by the rice field saw her first. They watched as she passed by, unsmiling, eyes wide and unblinking. One girl swore the woman's feet didn't make footprints. Another she saw paper crumple where the qipao touched the grass. She looked like a drawing, one whispered. She looked like the bride, said another. The girl didn't stop until she reached the village square. There, under the shade of the old camphor tree, she knocked on the door of the village elder's home. When he answered, she greeted him with a deep bow and a phrase that made his spine go cold. "Uncle Shan, it's been so long since you last visited my father's shrine." Uncle Shan hadn't heard that name, his real ancestral name, in over 50 years. It wasn't written, it wasn't spoken. It had only ever been used once in a naming ritual before his own mother died. "Who are you?" he whispered, but the girl only smiled. "I'm Yuan Wei's fiancé. He invited me here. You must have heard." And then she walked past him, straight through the village, as if she'd lived there all her life. She knew every turn. She knew which stone on the path was loose. She nodded to each home as if greeting old friends. And when she reached the Yuan household gate, she didn't knock. She simply placed her palm on the wood, and it swung open. Madame Yuan, who hadn't eaten since the wedding, stood up the moment the girl stepped inside. Their eyes met. The old woman's lips trembled. The girl bowed. "Mother," she said softly, "I'm home." And just like that, without question, they let her in. She walked straight to Yuan Wei's old room, laid out his mat, placed her folded qipao beside his robe, sat before the ancestral tablet, and lit 3 sticks of incense with hands that didn't shake. That night, when the neighbors passed by, they heard soft footsteps from the room. Not heavy ones, not human ones. Paper rustling, like someone made of silk and ash was walking across the floor. The Yuan home was quiet that night. Too quiet. Normally, the old wooden beams groaned as they settled. The wind rattled the red charms hanging from the eaves. Crickets chirped from the rice paddies. But not tonight. Tonight, everything held its breath. Inside the house, the girl had closed the door to Yuan Wei's old room. No one was allowed in, not even Madame Yuan, not even to deliver food or light incense. Yet in the morning, the bowls left outside the door were always empty. The joss sticks were burned to ash. The water dish, untouched by human hands, had fingerprints along the rim. The first night, the villagers thought it was coincidence. The second night, they stayed awake to listen. What they heard made their skin crawl. Not footsteps, but crinkling, like parchment being folded, unfolded, folded again. And then came the humming, a soft, tuneless melody, childlike, sweet, the kind of tune sung by paper dolls in certain opera performances, ones that no one staged anymore. Old Uncle Bao, who lived just 2 doors down, muttered in the morning, "I haven't heard that song in 60 years. My grandmother used to hum it when folding funeral offerings." But the girl never spoke of the nights, only smiled by day. She rose with the sun, swept the courtyard like a dutiful daughter-in-law, prepared Yuan Wei's favorite dishes, pickled radish with star anise, lotus root soup with dried dates, and placed them neatly in front of his altar. She knew the exact proportions of soy to vinegar. She knew his allergies. She even knew how he preferred his tea, steeped exactly 3 minutes, no more, no less. When asked how she learned, she simply replied, "He told me." The village grew tense. No one remembered inviting her. There had been no letters, no matchmakers, no public announcement of a living engagement before Yuan Wei died. Yet she moved through the house like she'd always belonged there. And worse, she remembered things no outsider could. She knew where Yuan Wei had hidden his carved wooden cat from childhood. She knew the names of ancestors never spoken aloud. She even corrected the family's placement of an urn on the shrine because it had been turned the wrong way for 13 years. Madame Yuan said nothing. Her eyes hollowed day by day, but she never denied the girl's presence. Instead, she whispered to herself as she swept, "She came because we asked. She came because he was alone. She came because I gave her a name." The girl remained quiet until one evening when Old Master Yuan finally spoke. He stood outside the door of his son's room and knocked once. No answer. He knocked again. Then her voice came from the other side, calm, steady, without emotion. "Father, I'm preparing our wedding bed." The old man turned pale. He didn't speak of it again. That night, the crinkling of paper was louder than ever. And in the morning, someone found the family's ancestral records, which had been locked for decades, spread open in the courtyard, every name carefully underlined in red ink. Every name, except hers. She wasn't written, but she remembered, and that, somehow, was worse. It began just after midnight. First, a soft hiss, like dry leaves being stirred by a breeze that wasn't there. Then, a single step. Not the heavy thud of flesh and bone, not the creak of worn floorboards, but a sound like paper being folded and unfolded, slow and deliberate. Crinkle, pause, crinkle, pause. The villagers heard it before the Juan family did. Uncle Bao sat up in his cot, eyes wide. "She's walking again," he whispered to himself, clutching his bedsheet as the sound passed his window. His dog whimpered and hid beneath the table, tail tucked, teeth clenched, but silent. At the Lee household, 2 doors down, an oil lamp flickered for no reason, twice. And in the shadow it cast on the far wall, the silhouette of a woman moved. But there was no one there. No footsteps ever followed the sound, only that crinkling, like someone made of thin, scorched parchment was gliding just inches above the floor. In the Yuan house, old Master Yuan had taken to locking his bedroom door each night, even though no one ever came for him. One night, when the sound passed too close, he pressed his ear against the wood. He heard breathing. Not human, not steady, but ragged, like torn silk being dragged across sharp nails. He never pressed his ear to that door again. By the 4th night, people began marking their thresholds with red thread, the kind used in ghost weddings to bind souls. They drew sigils in chalk by their windows. Even the local priest, who had long dismissed village superstitions, began leaving a knife under his pillow. But it didn't help, because the girl didn't haunt them like a ghost. She walked among them like something almost human. She still smiled in the mornings, still greeted elders with bows, still swept the Yuan courtyard and folded the laundry and placed tea beside the shrine. But her presence carried weight. Wherever she stepped, insects died. Wherever she lingered, candles bent unnaturally to one side, even without wind. And when she passed mirrors, they fogged, not with heat or breath, but as if something cold inside the glass recoiled. The children who once played freely now refused to leave their homes after dusk. They said she visited their dreams. In one dream, a boy said she handed him an origami dove, then watched as it bled from its wings. In another dream, a girl claimed the red thread around her wrist began tightening on its own as the woman's paper fingers reached out. Madame Juan, once defiant, began praying again, but never aloud. She sat in the dark with a single candle and mumbled words older than the village itself. Because something had changed. The girl no longer referred to Yuan Wei in past tense. He likes his soup warmer. He says the incense smoke is too bitter today. He misses walking through the fields. But Yuan Wei was still dead. Wasn't he? Then, on the seventh night after her arrival, someone disrespected her. An old cousin of the Juans, a bitter man who had once been denied inheritance, mocked her behind closed doors. "Paper whore, what bride needs no dowry?" He laughed. That night, he did not return home. The next morning, they found him, not in his bed, not in the fields, but folded, limb by limb, knees tucked to chest, arms crossed tight, neck bent at an unnatural angle, head pressed flat against his torso. He was placed in a paper offering box, the kind burned at funerals, but no one saw flames, and the lid was sealed shut with red thread. The box was left in front of the ancestral hall, plain, square, the size of a coffin for a child. No markings except for one thing, a thin strip of red paper pasted across the lid, painted with a single black stroke. A name. Zhu Feng, the cousin who insulted the paper bride. When the villagers unsealed the box, they recoiled. Inside was Zhu Feng's body, creased and folded as if made from human parchment. His skin bore sharp lines, edges flattened with inhuman precision. His spine had been tucked like origami, vertebrae collapsed into an unnatural arc. His eyes were closed, not peacefully, but crumpled inward, as if someone had pressed down on his face to fit the shape of the container. And he wasn't the only one. Over the next 2 nights, 2 more villagers vanished. One was a local boy who had joked with friends that the bride's feet looked too small to be real. They found him behind the paper workshop, twisted into a fan shape. Arms fanned out, legs pressed together, a red ribbon tied neatly around his torso. His tongue had been replaced by a sliver of scorched paper. The other was an old woman who'd whispered to her daughter that the bride's smile didn't reach her eyes. She was never found whole. Only her hair, braided into long paper strips, was discovered hanging from the camphor tree where the bride first appeared. It was then that the villagers understood. She wasn't killing from anger. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was correcting. Anyone who challenged her presence, anyone who denied her right to belong, became misfolded, discarded, like imperfect funeral offerings. The elders convened. They spoke in hushed tones behind temple doors, hands shaking as they reviewed the ancient books. One monk pulled out a brittle scroll, long forbidden, containing the rites of living spirit binding, an old outlawed ritual from the pre-Qin dynasties, said to create paper constructs that hold the memories of the dead. The monk's voice was barely a whisper. To create a true bride for the afterlife, she must be named, dressed, burned, and sealed into memory with blood. But if the name is written twice, once for the living, once for the dead, then the offering may return, not as a vessel, but as a being. The villagers turned pale, because in her room, the paper bride had placed 2 name scrolls on the altar. One bore Yuan Mei's name, the other her own, Lin Qing, and between them burned a single candle that never went out, no matter how long it burned. Meanwhile, the Yuan family fell deeper into silence. Madame Yuan spoke less and less. Her hair grayed overnight. Her fingers, once nimble, now trembled constantly. She told no one what she saw in her dreams. Of Yuan Wei, smiling, yes, but never blinking. Of Lin Qing, standing beside him in her scorched qipao, holding his hand with fingers that crinkled when they moved. And of the wedding she now believed was not symbolic, but ongoing. Every offering, every incense, every rolled robe, every dish of rice. It wasn't tradition anymore. It was part of the vow, a vow that could not be undone. One night the bride came to the ancestral hall. She carried something in her hands, a small paper box, neatly folded, sealed with red string. She placed it gently beside the shrine and bowed. When the priest approached it the next morning, he hesitated. Something inside was moving, soft, delicate, like fluttering wings. He didn't open it. He couldn't, because pressed against the inside wall of the box was a shadow, not cast by the sun, but by someone kneeling inside, patiently waiting to unfold. They sought the old paper artisan again, the one who had folded Lin Qing into being. She lived at the edge of the village, in a home woven with dust and silence. No one had seen her in days, not since the night she completed the bride's body. 3 elders and a trembling priest approached her door just after dawn. They knocked once, no answer. Knocked twice, still silence. On the 3rd knock, the door creaked open by itself. Inside, the house smelled of scorched incense and dried glue. Stacks of ceremonial joss paper were arranged like altars around the room. Some folded into animals, others into dresses, still others into human limbs. And in the center of it all, beneath a paper canopy laced with red thread, sat the artisan, or what was left of her. She hadn't died violently. No blood, no wounds. Just folded. Her body was bent inward like a collapsed fan. her knees drawn to her chest, her spine pressed into the floor, her arms folded across her face. Her skin had dried, yellowed, and bore crease lines from shoulder to wrist. There was no sign of struggle. But next to her, placed carefully on a lacquered tray, was a brush, a bowl of dried ink, and a scroll. The priest unrolled it, hands shaking. There were no characters, no words, just drawings. Precise instructions, step by step, for crafting a spirit-bound paper bride. Each diagram showed how to cut the limbs, fold the joints, sew the ribs with red thread, and seal the mouth with blood wax. At the bottom of the scroll was a single warning, scrawled in hurried, spidery script. Do not give her eyes. Do not write her name. Do not call her back if she turns. But it was too late, because Lin Qing had eyes painted with powdered charcoal and goat ash. She had a name, spoken by Madame Yuan in the temple after midnight, and she had turned the moment the wind blew the ashes back toward the altar. In the days that followed, villagers began finding strange things at their doorsteps. A bundle of hair wrapped in yellow silk, a folded napkin stained with old ink shaped like a mouth, red thread wound around a nail. Each item was part of a body, but not human anymore. They were parts meant for replacement, because Lin Qing was not fading like a proper offering. She was repairing herself, piece by piece, fold by fold. And each time someone gossiped about her, mocked her, or denied her existence, she took something, a voice, a finger, a dream, and used it to make herself more complete. The village seamstress lost her hands. The school teacher lost his tongue. A child woke screaming, his lips sewn shut with red thread he hadn't owned. At the temple, the priest made a final plea. They had to undo the marriage, burn the name scroll, scatter the ashes at the river, speak the unbinding rites. But Madame Yuan refused. Her voice, brittle and soft, replied, "We gave her a name. We welcomed her into our home. She eats at our table. She calls me mother. And most of all, she makes my son smile again." And when the priest turned to leave, he swore he saw a shadow in the hallway that paused, folded in on itself, and vanished like paper in the wind. The priest could no longer sleep. Each night he heard the same sound outside his window, a soft whisper, like parchment sliding across wood. Then a voice, barely audible, "You forgot the second name." At first, he tried prayer, then salt, then wards, then silence. But the voice kept returning, until on the seventh night, he woke to find a scroll nailed to his door, not with a tack, not with glue, but with a long, thin needle, the kind used in funerary weaving, meant for stitching paper garments onto the dead. His hands trembled as he unrolled it. There were two names written in perfect calligraphy, Yuan Wei and Ling Jing. But Yuan Wei's name had begun to fade, the strokes smudged like water-stained ink, while Lin Qing's name was growing darker. And beneath the scroll, etched not in ink but in ash, was a third line, added later, not part of the ritual. One leaves, one stays. The priest staggered back. He now understood. This wasn't a marriage between equals. It was a replacement. The offering had turned. The soul had bound too tightly. And now the spirit of Ling Qing, once just folded paper and memory, was anchoring herself into the world, using Yuan Wei's fading presence to stay. The red thread wasn't connecting them in love. It was draining him, one strand at a time. Meanwhile, inside the Yuan household, Madame Yuan began hearing things in her sleep. Footsteps that didn't match her own, laughter echoing from empty rooms, and whispers through the walls. He's almost ready. Just a few more folds, just one more cut. She began finding tiny paper figures on the floor, little effigies with Yuan Wei's face, folded from funeral money, each one burned slightly at the corners. Every night a new one appeared. By the 7th night, there were 49 of them. 7 times 7, the number of nights in the Taoist cycle of death, the night before the soul crosses over. But Yuan Wei wasn't crossing over, because Ling Qing wouldn't let him. She was keeping him here, tethered to her, through memory, through name, through every offering the family unknowingly made. One afternoon, a neighbor spotted the girl outside the house, holding a mirror. She was looking at her reflection, not admiring, not curious, but correcting. She pinched her paper cheek and creased it downward, smoothing the fold along her jawline. She adjusted the slope of her nose, tilted her eyes until the line matched the exact curve of a photograph inside the shrine, Yuan Wei's photograph. She wasn't just staying in this world, she was becoming someone else in it. At dusk, the priest returned to the Yuan home, scroll in hand, determined to confront them. But as he stepped into the courtyard, the air thickened. The wind stopped, the trees held their breath, and Ling Qing stood in the doorway, holding a red lacquer box. She opened it slowly, revealing inside 2 locks of hair, a broken incense stick, a name scroll written in mirror script, and a thin, delicate tongue, not human anymore, but curled like a chrysanthemum petal made of ash. She smiled. "He gave it to me," she said. "He said I could speak for him now." Then she closed the box, and the door shut behind her on its own. That night, the wind returned, but it didn't blow toward the mountains. It blew inward, toward the village, carrying with it the scent of burned ink and the rustle of paper walking. She lived in the farthest corner of Shangwan village, where the river bends and the soil turns black from old ash. Her name was Granny May, 93, nearly blind, her back bent like a question mark carved by time. Most thought she was too old to matter, too senile to speak truth. But Granny May had survived the flood of 48, the famine of 62, the fire that consumed the ancestral archives in 77. She had outlived 3 sons and 2 husbands, and more importantly, she had seen the first Lin Qing. No one remembered her, but Granny May did. And when she heard the village whisper the name again, Lin Qing, Lin Qing, she began to weep. One morning the priest came to visit, clutching the scroll with the twin names. He found Granny May staring at her window, hands trembling in her lap, eyes glazed over with a film of fog. She didn't turn when he entered. She simply whispered, "They burned her alive." The priest froze. She spoke again, this time louder. 71 years ago, the Yuan family's firstborn was supposed to marry a girl from Chengdu, daughter of a tea merchant, beautiful, educated. But she ran away the day before the wedding. So they chose her handmaid instead, Lin Qing. She was quiet, dutiful, born of no name, no family. They said, better a servant than an empty altar. They dressed her in red, painted her face, told her she was lucky. But the bride never showed, and the Yuan family couldn't face shame. So they sealed Lin Chen in the paper coffin meant for the real bride, and burned her while she screamed. The priest couldn't speak. The air in the room had gone thin. Outside the wind picked up, but not like wind. It whistled through the house like breath through a flute, a warning. Granny May leaned forward, her cloudy eyes staring through the priest, not at him. They didn't bury her bones. They swept them into the river. But the name stayed. It waited until someone called it again. That night the village drums, long silent, rang once, and a red ribbon was found tied around the camphor tree. Pinned to it was a photograph, old, sepia-toned, torn at the edge. It showed Lin Qing, the real one, not the paper bride, but the girl who once smiled beneath a red veil that was never meant for her. In the picture, her eyes were soft, hopeful, innocent, but someone, recently, had scratched them out. And beneath the photo, written in neat brushstrokes, "You gave me to the fire, but now I burn for you." The next day, Granny May was gone. Her bed untouched, her windows locked, no footprints, no trail. Only a folded origami lotus flower sat on her pillow, and inside its center was a lock of her white hair, tied with red thread. The wind no longer whispered, it spoke. At first it was subtle, a phrase here, a murmur there, heard only when someone stood near the Yuan family gate. "I miss the jasmine fields. Mother, the rice is burning again. Father, why did you leave me alone in the river?" The villagers tried to dismiss it. They told themselves it was grief echoing through old wood, memory trapped in weathered walls, until the voices began speaking in Yuan Wei's tone, perfectly, painfully, undeniably his. The first to hear him clearly was Madame Yuan. She had taken to sleeping in the shrine room, curled beneath her son's old quilt, surrounded by fading photographs and bowls of cold rice left for the dead. She awoke one night to a sound that hadn't filled the house since before the funeral. Laughter. Soft, familiar. Then came the knock, 3 times on the sliding wooden door. She sat up, heart thundering, hands clenched over her chest. "Who is it?" she whispered. And the voice replied, "It's me, Mother." She opened the door. No one stood there, only the paper bride, standing silently, holding a lantern. Her face was passive, unmoving, but the voice that came from her mouth was Yuan Wei's. "Why did you bury me with someone else? Why did you give me a wife I don't remember? Why did she speak my name before I could say goodbye?" Madame Yuan fell to her knees. She sobbed, but not in sorrow, in relief. "You're still here. You're still with me." The paper bride knelt beside her, placed a cold hand on her cheek. "Yes, Mother, we're both here now, forever." From that night onward, she was no longer just a bride. She was a mouthpiece. She spoke with his voice to his parents, to the village elder, to the cousin who still dared to mutter doubts. She remembered things Yuan Wei alone had known, the names of friends from childhood, the spot behind the altar where he hid rice cakes as a boy, the nickname his father whispered when drunk, Little Stone. Each time she spoke, she became more convincing, more human, but not quite, because her lips moved a moment too late, because her words always ended with a faint crackle like paper tearing. And when she smiled, it was always with Yuan Wei's eyes, not her own. One morning, the village priest returned to confront her. He stood in the courtyard, scroll in hand, voice trembling with sacred verses. He called on ancient rites to sever bonds between realms, but she stepped forward, barefoot on the cold stone, and raised a single finger. The wind died, and then she spoke, with both voices, Yuan Wei's, deep and mournful, and Lin Qing's, high and distant, like wind through silk. They spoke in unison, overlapping in unnatural harmony. "He is not bound. I am not possessed. We are one. You burned us both. Now we speak with the same breath." And then she whispered a name, the priest's real name, the one hidden since his youth, never spoken aloud. His face drained of color. He dropped the scroll. She picked it up, folded it in half, and handed it back to him, creased perfectly down the middle. And she said, "You may go, for now." That night, the village began hearing two sets of footsteps in the Yuan house. One, light, crisp, like paper shoes. The other, heavier, familiar, like a son come home. They say spirits cling not to places, but to memory. And in Xiangwan village, memory ran deep, like roots under a grave, twisting beneath every home, every floorboard, every breath. After the 10th night, the people began to change. Not all at once, not loudly, but slowly, like folds in paper tightening over time. It started with the children. They began drawing pictures, not of trees or cats or lanterns, but of a bride in red with no face, always the same shape, tall, slender, with a slash of black where her eyes should be. Some children folded their drawings into dolls and placed them outside the Yuan house without knowing why. One boy was caught speaking to his drawing in whispers. "She says my grandpa lied. She says he watched her burn." That boy's grandfather died the next day. Heart burst in the middle of prayer, face twisted in fear. When the family found him, his body was creased at the ribs. Others began to dream. In sleep, they stood in an endless paper hall, white walls, red thread hanging from the ceiling like veins. In the center, Lin Qing waited, always smiling, always silent. And behind her stood Yuan Wei. But he no longer looked like himself. His features had softened, blurred. His mouth no longer opened. His eyes were flat, painted on. as if he too was now folded. Aunt Bao, the village midwife, was one of the first to speak out. She's taking their grief, feeding on what they can't let go of. Every time we remember what happened to her, we give her shape. Every time we whisper her name, we sharpen her edges. She doesn't need a body, she needs a memory. But no one listened, because by then half the village had begun calling her daughter-in-law without thinking. They set out bowls of rice on their altars, not for Yuan Wei, but for her. They swept their floors in silence, lest the crinkle of paper return. Some even began wearing red thread around their fingers, twisted into small bows, a symbol, they said, of respect for the dead bride. They didn't realize what they were doing. They were binding themselves. A week later, 2 women vanished. Both had tried to burn old photos from the wedding, hoping to sever the connection. One was found days later, kneeling in her garden. Her body was untouched, but her mouth had been replaced by a paper fold. No lips, no teeth, just a pleat where words used to be. The other was never found, but her mirror shattered in the middle of the night, and inside it, reflected for just a moment, was a bride in red, walking backward. The priest tried again. He gathered what few scrolls remained from the burned archives. He found a forgotten rite, the unfolding ritual, meant to release a bound spirit back to ash. But it required something no one wanted to give: a full name, spoken by blood, written with intent. The problem was Lin Qing no longer belonged to any one name. She had taken all the grief, all the remembrance, all the unspoken guilt, and folded them into herself. She had become more than memory. She had become echo. And echoes, once strong enough, speak louder than the living. One night, the paper bride walked through the village again. Not silently this time. She sang a wedding song, slow, hollow, the same one used 71 years ago when the Yuan family burned the wrong girl. As she passed each home, mirrors fogged, candles bent, and doors unlocked themselves. By dawn, 7 houses had folded inward, walls buckled, roofs collapsed, windows twisted shut like origami closing in reverse. Inside each was a token: a comb, a red shoe, a paper ring, a name scroll, a folded tongue, a burning incense stick, a single black hair curled in ash. Each one a gift, each one a warning. It surfaced without warning. No one knew who placed it there. One rainy morning, a black and white photograph appeared, taped to the village bulletin board, right beside a faded poster for the spring festival that never happened. It wasn't old. It wasn't yellowed. In fact, the paper was too clean, the edges sharp as if freshly cut. But the image was wrong. It showed the entire Yuan family, mother, father, Yuan Wei, and the bride, Lin Qing, standing perfectly still beside him in her red qipao, veil lifted just slightly to reveal half a smile. But here's the thing: that photograph never existed. There had been no camera at the ghost wedding, no photographer, no light, no witnesses outside the ritual circle. Yet there she was, as real as ink, folded into the family frame. The villagers gathered around the board, whispering. Some swore her eyes moved. Others claimed the photo changed depending on who looked at it. One man saw her holding Yuan Wei's hand. A child said she was alone. Everyone else blurred. An old woman fainted after seeing herself in the background, standing among the guests, even though she hadn't attended. The priest, when summoned, approached with shaking hands and tried to remove it. But the moment he touched the photo, his fingers creased, right down the middle, skin folding unnaturally, bones compressing like damp cardboard. He screamed, dropping to his knees, clutching his hand as it crumpled into itself. The photo remained stuck to the board, untouched, unmoving, smiling. That night, someone tried to burn it. A young man from the next village over, curious, bold, foolish, snuck in with a lighter. Witnesses say they saw him flick the flame, saw the edges of the photo blacken, but before the fire could catch, he vanished. In front of everyone, just gone. No scream, no wind, no trace. Only a folded square of red paper fell to the ground where he'd stood. When someone picked it up and unfolded it, inside was a drawing of him bent at the knees, mouth open in horror, eyes scratched out. Beneath the drawing, in tiny brushstroke calligraphy, "Do not erase what is already bound." The photo stayed. By morning, it had multiplied. Now there were 5 photos, each slightly different. In one, Lin Qing sat beside Yuan Wei, pouring tea. In another, she stood in front of the family shrine wearing a jade pendant that no one remembered gifting her. In the last, she looked straight into the lens, and her smile was gone. Just lips, tightly pressed, a slight crease on her cheek, and behind her, almost hidden, a pair of paper hands reaching from the shadows. The priest issued a final warning. "Do not look anymore. Do not remember her when you close your eyes. She grows with your recognition. She breathes through your attention. And every time you say her name," he looked around at the crowd, at the faces now half glazed with fear, half lost to resignation. Then he whispered, "You fold her deeper into this world." That night, as the wind howled and lanterns flickered, the 5 photos on the bulletin board curled at the corners, and by morning they were gone. In their place was a single sheet of folded red paper, pressed flat against the board, creased with the shape of a bride's veil, and beneath it, written in ash, "One photograph was enough. You kept looking, so I stayed." By the 13th night, the air in Shangguan village had changed. Not just heavy, not just cold, but thick, as though soaked in oil, refusing to move. Candles no longer lit the same way. Mirrors dulled even when freshly polished, and food left out for ancestors spoiled by dawn, even in the cold. But strangest of all was her skin. Lin Qing's. It was no longer just paper. A rice seller named Hong Wei, brave or foolish, dared to follow her one morning. He trailed her quietly as she walked past the river bend, heading toward the woods where the wedding ashes at first refused to scatter. He swore later, before he lost his tongue, that he saw her remove her shoes and step into the river. But the water did not soak her. Instead, it beaded on her skin like raindrops on oiled silk. He crouched closer, squinting, and that's when he saw it. Her calf bore a thin seam, a delicate fold line like origami smoothed flat. And just below her ankle, something moved beneath the surface of her skin. A thread, red, alive, crawling. He gasped. She turned, smiled. "You shouldn't be here," she said. That evening, Hong Wei returned home. He couldn't speak, couldn't eat. His hands trembled constantly. But in the center of his palm, a new crease had formed, and it deepened each day until his fingers curled involuntarily, locked in the pose of a paper doll mid-bow. Elsewhere, Lin Qing continued her transformation. People began to notice small changes. Her movements slowed, less stiff, more fluid. Her voice deepened, not louder, but rounder, like lungs had grown behind it. Her shadow lengthened, not with the sun, but with the moon. The red qipao she always wore, once stiff with ceremonial lacquer, now flowed as if woven from silk instead of fireproof pulp. And her hair? It began to fall loose in strands. Not ribbons, strands. One afternoon, a seamstress named Xu Lan was called to the Yuan house. Lin Qing greeted her at the door. "I'd like a new dress, something softer, something that breathes." Xu Lan hesitated. "The red one is beautiful." Lin Qing smiled politely. "That one burned. It doesn't fit anymore." When she took her measurements, her fingers brushed Lin Qing's wrist. She flinched. It felt like warm wax under fabric, supple, yielding. But when she looked closer, there were still fold lines beneath the surface, like the skin had grown over paper, like the flesh remembered it wasn't real. Xu Lan never finished the dress. That night, her family found her sewing machine torn apart, threads tied around her neck in tight, perfect bows, and on her work table, a sheet of red paper folded into the shape of a thimble, dripping with blood. By now, the villagers stopped calling her the paper bride. They started calling her the walking vow. Because she wasn't just a ghost. She wasn't just memory. She was a promise kept too long. A promise folded again and again until it took on weight, took on skin, took on hunger. And she was still unfolding. One morning, Madame Yuan asked her quietly, "Are you still my daughter-in-law?" She turned, blinked slowly. Then she reached for Madame Yuan's hand and placed it on her own cheek. It was warm, too warm. "I am, but soon I'll be more." Madame Yuan trembled. "More than what?" Lin Qing's smile didn't reach her eyes. "More than bride, more than memory, more than paper. Soon I'll be real." They didn't receive invitations. There were no drums, no banners, no red silk fluttering in the breeze. And yet, every villager knew the wedding was coming again. Not just the anniversary of the ghost marriage, not a remembrance, but something new, something alive. It began with the bells. The ancestral bell in the temple, rusted, untouched for decades, rang once at midnight. No one pulled the rope, no wind blew through, but the sound echoed through the hills, deep and full, like it had been waiting for years to speak. Then came the gifts. Each household in Shangwan village woke to find a small red box outside their door. Inside each box was something personal. A strand of the recipient's hair tied with red thread, a miniature folding fan with their name etched into the wood, a piece of old parchment with a vow written in brushstroke calligraphy. to witness, to remember, to never turn away again. At the Yuan home, Lin Qing was preparing. She wore a new dress, hand-stitched from both fabric and something else. It shimmered when she moved, not like silk, but like folded lacquer polished into skin. In the center of the courtyard, she arranged 7 chairs, 6 for the dead, 1 for the groom. Yuan Wei's portrait had been taken down from the shrine and placed gently on a wooden stool. Fresh incense was lit, but no one could explain why the photo looked different now. His expression had changed. He no longer smiled. His lips were parted, as if ready to speak. Madame Yuan watched from the shadows, hands wringing her prayer beads raw. "What is this? What are you doing?" she whispered. Lin Qing didn't turn. "Rehearsal," she said softly. "A bride must practice for the real day. It must be perfect, so he won't forget. So none of you will." And then she sang, a low, melodic chant, the same haunting wedding song from generations past, the one that accompanied her burning, except now she sang it with a second voice beneath her own. Yuan Wei's, deep, hollow, echoed. That night, 3 villagers disappeared. Their homes were found untouched, but on each of their pillows lay a folded slip of red paper. When unfolded, each slip revealed a different message. I said yes. He's awake now. Bring the mirrors. I want to see myself walk. The village priest attempted one final rite of severing. He gathered the remaining elders in the temple and lit 7 black candles, each representing a broken vow from the original ghost marriage. But before the incantation could be completed, the flames curled inward, spiraling into themselves. The smoke rose, not gray, but red. It formed a shape, a veil, a hand, a face. And then Lin Qing's voice filled the hall. "You watched me burn. You gave me away like scrap. And now you want silence?" The candles burst. The scrolls turned to ash. And outside the temple door, a single red shoe appeared, still warm, still damp from the river. By morning, the village was quiet again, but not empty, because every mirror and shangwan had begun to fog over, not from moisture, but from something pressing inward, from behind the glass, waiting. And in each reflection, if one looked too long, they would see a bride rehearsing her walk, step by step, fold by fold, until the veil rose and she looked back. It was the 21st night, the number sacred in old rites. 3 sevens, a full soul cycle. The villagers stayed indoors, doors bolted with red twine, windows smeared with garlic and ash. But it didn't matter anymore, because he came home. It began just before dawn, a soft knock at the Yuan family gate. Not frantic, not loud, but rhythmic, like fingers drumming gently on wood. Madame Yuan rose from her bed, barefoot, lips trembling. "Who's there?" No answer. Only a second knock. Then a voice, gentle, Familiar. Too familiar. "Mother, it's cold out here. I forgot my keys." She clutched her chest. "Where?" Silence. Then a third knock. She ran to the door, but before she could open it, Lin Qing was there, already standing at the gate, her fingers resting lightly on the latch. She turned to Madame Yuan. "He's ready. Tonight we finish what you started." And she opened the gate. There was no one on the other side. No body, no shadow, only a trail of wet footprints leading back to Yuan Wei's old room. Footprints that stopped just before the threshold, because he didn't walk in. He was already inside. That evening, as dusk spilled over the hills, the village held its breath, not because of what they saw, but because of what they felt. A new weight, a presence layered over the village like lacquer, thick, glossy, irreversible. And then, for the first time in weeks, the Yuan household doors opened wide. Red silk hung from the beams. A table was set for two. The air smelled of sandalwood, smoke, and memory. At the center of it all stood Lin Qing, veiled, radiant, impossibly still. And beside her, Yuan Wei, or something wearing his shape. He looked as he did before, tall, calm, kind. But his eyes did not blink. His skin bore a pale translucence, and his smile, though warm, ended in creased lines as if folded from within. The villagers, watching from the distance, said nothing, because somehow this felt inevitable, not a haunting, but a homecoming. Inside the house, Madame Yuan collapsed to her knees. "My son, is it really you?" Yuan Lei turned. He opened his mouth, but Lin Qing answered for him, her voice layered over his, echoing as one. "He is mine now. You gave him to me. You named me. You burned me. And when I walked back, you let me in. Tonight, he returns the vow." And then, the marriage began. No priest, no guests, only firelight, and the sound of paper unfolding. The villagers swore the wind that night carried not just ash, but whispers. One breath, one soul, one name. When the lanterns outside the Yuan house extinguished themselves, no one dared reignite them. Because what had joined that night was not man and woman, but flesh and fold, memory and myth, sun and silence. By morning, the house was empty, not broken, not burned, just quiet. In Yuan Wei's room there were 2 sleeping mats, 2 teacups, 2 toothbrushes, 2 shadows cast by no sun, and on the altar, a single wedding photograph, framed in black lacquer, showing Lin Qing and Yuan Wei side by side, smiling, still, folded into forever.
The strange thing wasn't that they were gone. The strange thing was how quickly everyone stopped noticing. By the 22nd morning, no one mentioned the Yuan family again. Not the wedding, not the bride, not the missing priest, not the folded bodies, not even the boy who vanished in front of the bulletin board. The village simply resumed. The rice cellar reopened, children played by the riverbank, the temple bell gathered dust again. It was as if someone had erased the crease from memory, smoothed the folds flat. But something remained. Something off. Not broken, just misaligned. People began to forget small things. Which direction the sun rose, where they had placed their shoes, the names of uncles buried just last year, the color of the paper burned during ancestor rites. It was subtle at first, then worse. A woman called her daughter by the wrong name and didn't notice. A man stood in front of his own house and didn't recognize it. A child cried because his mother's face looked right but felt wrong, like a mask made of memory. At night, reflections twisted, in basins, in glass, in polished spoons. People saw not themselves, but versions of themselves, creased at the edges, as if someone had folded their lives too many times and was now unfolding the mistakes. One woman smashed every mirror in her home. She was found the next morning sleeping peacefully, but her skin bore the imprint of fold lines across her cheek, her collarbone, the backs of her knees, as if she had once been flattened and pressed back into shape. Then came the dreams. Not nightmares, just rehearsals. The same wedding, again and again, but viewed behind a veil. A silent ceremony, a red candle, a name whispered thrice, a face they both knew and didn't. In every dream they held the same thought, I am part of this. And when they woke, they often found red thread curled beneath their pillow. The old records in the temple slowly rewrote themselves. The Yuan family line no longer ended at Yuan Wei. There was now an entry beneath his name. Spouse, Lin Qing. Year of marriage, eternal. The village priest scrolls, once full of counter-rituals and warnings, had crumbled into ash. All that remained were fragments of one phrase. What is folded cannot be undone. By the next full moon, new wedding rituals emerged. No one knew where they came from, but brides began wearing veils longer than their arms. Grooms stopped speaking during the ceremony, and parents began writing the names of the couple on slips of red paper and burning them before the altar. When asked why, they simply replied, "It's tradition. It's always been done, so they don't come back wrong." But no one could explain who they were, because no one remembered, not clearly. Just shapes in the corner of the eye, a crinkle when no one was walking, the smell of burnt paper with no fire. And somewhere, in the woods beyond the river, a small house sat undisturbed. Inside were 2 mats, 2 cups, 2 toothbrushes, and a framed photo, dusty with time, yet untouched by decay. Lin Qing and Yuan Wei, still smiling, still together, still folded neatly into a world that had forgotten them, so they could stay forever. No one spoke her name anymore, not out of fear, but because it simply faded, washed away like chalk in rain. Even those who had once whispered Lin Qing's story behind closed doors found their tongues stiff when they tried to recall her. They remembered the silence, the unease, the shadows, the red thread, but not her, not directly, until the mirrors began to turn. It started in the temple, the polished bronze mirror above the ancestor altar, untouched for generations, began to tilt on its own. Not violently, not suddenly, just slowly. Each day it shifted a little more, until its surface no longer faced the sky, but faced the village, reflected the street, the homes, the people, watching. Soon the other mirrors followed. Shaving mirrors leaned toward windows. Compact mirrors refused to shut. Even water basins rippled when no one touched them, their surfaces trembling as if someone was staring up from beneath. And when people looked, they didn't always see themselves. Some saw a bride in red standing just behind them, veil down, face obscured. Others saw their own reflection, but with creased skin, paper-pale cheeks, and smiles not their own. A few screamed, a few fainted, but most simply turned the mirrors face down, until the mirrors turned themselves back up. In one household, a woman caught her reflection blinking out of rhythm. She moved left, the reflection moved right. She dropped the mirror. It didn't shut her. It bent, folded in on itself, a crease forming through the center, until the glass resembled the fold of a veil mid-lift. The children spoke of her first. They called her the Mirror Bride. She lives in the reflections, one girl said. She's looking for herself, said another. She wants to remember what face she had before the fire. And at night their games changed. They no longer played hide and seek. They played fold and mirror, where one child hides behind the curtain and the others must guess their name before the reflection appears. If they get it wrong, the curtain is left closed, so the bride can try them on. The priest, what remained of him, wrote one final warning before disappearing entirely. Scratched into the back of his prayer table with a bone comb, "She is no longer memory, she is template. Every mirror you look into now, she looks at, and every time you ask, 'Is that really me?' she folds you a little closer to yes." Then the vanishings resumed, one by one. No screams, no struggle, just a mirror left on the floor, still warm, still fogged, still reflecting someone who was no longer there. And in the center, always, a perfect crease, like the glass had been folded shut. Some villagers sealed their homes, others covered every reflective surface with red cloth, but the cloths never stayed. Each morning they were found neatly folded on the doorstep, each with a message written in soot. "You only forget what you once knew, and you once knew me. Look again." In the center of Shangwan village, where the old stone well stood, a single red lantern appeared one morning. No one had hung it. No one had seen it being lit. And yet it swayed gently in a wind that didn't blow. The flame inside glowed steadily, soft, golden, unnaturally still. Not flickering, not fading. It burned through rain. It burned through wind. It even burned through morning. Because by now, the villagers had stopped burying their dead. There were no bodies to find, only creases in bedsheets, only shadows where someone used to stand, only mirrors that refused to reflect the person calling them by name. The lantern was made of old rice paper, stitched with red thread so fine it looked like veins. Its base was bound in black lacquer, carved with unfamiliar characters. When the village elder approached to examine it, he paused beneath the lantern's glow. Then he whispered, without knowing why, "This is the vow that never ended." He couldn't remember where the words came from. He couldn't remember ever having heard them before. But the moment he spoke them aloud, the flame in the lantern flared, not bright, but deep, as though another soul had just been claimed. Over the next nights, no one dared walk past the well, because the lantern began to speak, not in words, but in memories. Whoever walked beneath it heard something they had tried to forget, a name whispered in a voice long dead, a moment they denied witnessing, the smell of burning silk from decades past. One man collapsed to his knees, sobbing, "I was there. I saw her tied to the frame. I said nothing. I thought it wasn't my place." The next morning, he was gone, and beside the lantern, a folded apology letter rested on the well's edge, burned at the corners, written in tears. No ink, just grief pressed into paper. The children, as always, knew before the adults. They said the lantern wasn't a light, it was an eye. She's watching through it. She sees who remembers. She sees who lies. One child, bold, angry, tired of the village's fear, threw a stone at it. The stone never reached. It stopped mid-air, then dropped like it had forgotten how to fly. That child never spoke again. She didn't go missing. She simply folded inward, day by day, word by word, until she sat in silence, arms around her knees, blinking in perfect time with the flame above the well. And still the lantern burned, through storms, through offerings, through desperate prayers written in blood. Even the priest, or the shadow of him, left one final note beside it. This flame is not fire. It is memory, kept alive by guilt, by the vow you never broke, by the name you still carry. Until someone dares to finish the wedding, she will keep the lantern lit. That night, the flame grew brighter, not enough to blind, just enough to reveal what hovered above it. A veil, tattered, floating, burned at the edges, but still red. And behind it, barely visible in the shadows, two faces, folded into one.
It began with a sound. Not thunder, not wind, not even the crinkle of paper the village had grown used to fearing. This was different. It was the sound of seams pulling apart, of something tightly pressed, finally loosening. Like a book sealed shut for generations, being opened to its final page. The villagers heard it at once, all of them, just before dawn, and they knew. She was unfolding. Not fading, not breaking, but becoming. The Yuan house, long silent, now pulsed with motion. Its wooden beams creaked with voices that had no mouths. Its windows shimmered with light from no source. Its walls exhaled like lungs long denied breath. Those brave enough to peer through the gate saw the impossible. The house itself was folding inward, corners creasing, walls bending, roof slanting, just like a paper box being prepared for something sacred. At its center stood Ling Qing, veil gone, eyes open, and her skin, no longer paper, no longer flesh, but a terrifying blend of both, alive with memory and marked with the folds of every whispered name, every denied sin, every ceremony left incomplete. She turned once, slowly, and the walls followed her movement. She was no longer confined by shape. She was the shape, the vow incarnate. In the sky above, the clouds thinned.
A brief light broke through, not sun, but something older, more ancestral. The villagers stepped from their homes as if summoned, not afraid, not brave, just resigned. They gathered in silence outside the Yuan gate, and they watched. Inside the courtyard, Yuan Wei stood beside Lin Qing. He was no longer just a shadow. He had form, he had breath, but his outline was not stable, as if he flickered between two realities. His eyes met hers, no words, just a nod. And Lin Qing raised her arms. The house finished folding. The wind stilled, and in the center of everything, the veil lifted. Then, the unfolding began. The wind reversed. From the Yuan house, a burst of paper and ash exploded outward, not destructive, but ceremonial, like a flower blooming in reverse. Memories spilled through the village like ink in water. Everyone saw everything. The wedding that never was, the girl forced to burn in place of another, the red thread soaked in silence, the moment her name was spoken twice, the sorrow, the blame, the love twisted into duty. And then the truth. She never wanted to return. She only wanted to be remembered right, to be honored as herself, not a placeholder, not an offering, not a folded name in someone else's ceremony. In that moment, something tore gently through reality, not a scream, not a rift, but a crease in time. And from it, Lin Qing stepped forward, not ghost, not bride, just woman. Her dress flowed like water, her eyes shimmered like flame over ink, and behind her Yuan Wei remained, silent but smiling. She looked at the villagers once last. No anger, no accusation, just a quiet question. Will you let me go now? And someone, no one remembered who, whispered, yes. With that, she bowed, folded once at the waist, once at the knees, once at the shoulders. Then she disappeared into the wind, like a paper crane tossed to the sky. Yuan Wei followed. No sound, no trace, only the soft hush of two names finally released. The Yuan house unfolded itself, plank by plank, like it had never existed, and where it once stood was only a square of burned earth, marked by a single red thread, looped into the shape of an infinity knot. The red lantern by the well extinguished at last, not with smoke, but with silence. Years passed, seasons came and went, children grew, old names faded, new houses were built. But where the Yuan house once stood, no one dared to build again. Not because of fear, not because of law, but because the land refused. Every attempt failed. One family tried planting rice there. The stalks twisted themselves into braid-like knots, refusing to grow straight. Another tried to pave it into a road, but the soil remained soft no matter how much stone they laid. The cart sank into it like it was remembering footsteps that no longer walked. Eventually, they left it alone. Not fenced, not marked, just a quiet square of cracked earth where grass never sprouted. But in the center, no matter how many rains came, No matter how many winters passed, the red thread remained, faded, frayed, but unbroken. The elders called it the place between names, not cursed, just unfinished, like a story that had finally stopped being told, but still echoed in the breath between sentences. Tourists sometimes came through. They took photos, asked questions. Why is that plot of land empty? No one gave the same answer. Some said it was where a house had folded itself away. Some said it was the site of a forgotten wedding. Some just shook their heads and walked faster. But the children, when no adults listened, whispered the truth. If you stand on it too long, you'll start remembering a name you never knew. On the night of the Ghost Festival, offerings were left at every doorstep. Candles, fruit, joss paper. But at the edge of the village, near the vacant earth, someone always left 2 bowls of rice, neatly placed side by side, one with a lotus petal, the other with a thin sliver of scorched red silk. No one claimed them, no one removed them. By morning, the bowls were always empty, and though the house never returned, neither did the folds in memory ever truly disappear, because sometimes in the hush before dawn, villagers swear they hear it, the faint rustle of paper feet, the echo of a name too soft to speak, and the gentle clink of teacups being set down in perfect rhythm, not haunting, not hurting, just a vow, remembered right.